All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my talk, Lessons in Lens Flares. Apologies for the brief technical difficulties there, but before we start, just a brief introduction. So my name is Anoop. I'm a real-time VFX artist at FXville, and I've been a hobbyist photographer, filmmaker, and animator for over 20 years. I'm also a lens flare enthusiast. So before we get right into it, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what this presentation is all about. There's a lot to talk about and limited time, so I'll be focusing more on discussing the key behaviors of different lens flares and how to create your own than giving a technical presentation on creating lens flares in any specific game engine. As with many things in game development, I've found that there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution for lens flares in game engines. So in this talk, I'm going to be focusing more on explaining the key behaviors of lens flares and my process for creating them. The reason this is relevant is essentially because as hardware improves and visual fidelity increases, lens flares are becoming an increasingly common task for real-time VFX artists, whereas they may have previously been considered more of a technical art task. So today, I'll begin by talking about the interaction between light and the camera lens before discussing some of the differences between spherical and anamorphic lenses using reference footage I've shot. After that, I'll discuss some general rules and rules of thumb to help you author your own lens flares, supplemented by more footage. And then finally, I'll show you my process for making a custom lens flare in After Effects. And we'll open it up to a quick Q&A after that, if time permits. All right, so let's begin with a simplification of how light interacts with the camera. In a modern camera lens, there's generally a bunch of glass lens elements that make up what we refer to as the lens. So before light can reach the image sensor, it's reflected and refracted as it passes through these lens elements. When I'm creating a lens flare, I like to think about the journey of light from the front element to the rear element and how that might affect the shapes, colors, and behaviors of my flare. I also look at reference footage and think about which lens elements correspond to which flare elements. It's worth noting lens manufacturers usually apply an anti-reflective coating to these that tends to influence the color of flare elements as well as the overall intensity and certain other factors, but we'll get into that later. To help create lens flares in any instance, here's a list of important concepts and rules I've compiled. We'll be discussing each of these in depth, but I wanted to run them up on the screen here first so that we can reference this slide later. Knowing these concepts as well as the context in which a flare will exist can make it a lot easier to implement a visually compelling lens flare that truly complements the overall composition of the frame while also respecting the physical nature of a real camera. So first on our list, the two major types of lenses we typically use are spherical and anamorphic lenses. Both produce vastly different lens flares, image artifacts, and out-of-focus bokeh effects. So understanding the difference between these is important when creating a flare of your own. So let's start with the far more common spherical lens. When shooting with a spherical lens, we generally expect to see radial rays around the light source, where the number of rays will usually correspond to the number of diaphragm blades. For those who may not know, aperture blades or diaphragm blades are the swiveling mechanical blades that control the size of the aperture, which essentially dictates how much light is let into the image sensor. And there's a stock image of what those look like. With spherical lenses, we also expect to see circular or polygonal bokeh and ghosts, which we haven't talked about just yet, but we'll be getting into that soon. Similarly, we see the number of sides of polygonal bokeh correspond to the number of aperture blades. And while it's perhaps not the most relevant to us in our real-time VFX context, it is important to note that we usually expect a 16:9 aspect ratio when shooting with a spherical lens, which is great because 16:9 is the most typical aspect ratio for our computer monitors, TVs, smartphones, and other displays. So generally, the framing and aspect ratio you see when shooting with a spherical lens is what you ultimately get in the final image before any post or editing, cropping work has been done. And so here's some reference footage I shot on a spherical lens. What you can see is that I have 14 aperture blades here, so we get 14 radial rays coming off the light source. And moving right along to my favorite, anamorphic lenses. So in general, anamorphic lenses tend to make things look and feel a lot more cinematic. They can also create a more painterly look than spherical lenses, which is due in part to their unique bokeh or out-of-focus effects, as well as their distortion. With an anamorphic lens, we tend to get horizontal streaks as our primary flare element. And depending on the lens, radial rays may also be present in an anamorphic flare, as we'll see here in a moment. They tend to have slightly different visuals and behaviors than the radial rays that we'd see or associate with spherical lenses, but a good rule of thumb is that they have more asymmetry. Anamorphic lenses also produce vertically stretched, oval-shaped bokeh for anything that's out of focus. However, the ghosts that we see in anamorphic flares can be vertically or horizontally stretched oval shapes. And another quirk of anamorphic lenses is that they produce an aspect ratio of 2.39 by 1, which is standardized as 21 by 9 for the digital format. There's a lot to talk about in this regard, so I'm going to keep it brief. But essentially, when we're shooting with an anamorphic lens, we're actually shooting on a square. So the original footage needs to be de-squeezed in an editing or compositing software so that we ultimately get that 21 by 9 widescreen aspect ratio with the signature cinematic black bars on the top and bottom of the screen. And here's some reference footage I shot on my anamorphic lens. You can see we get that our primary element is those horizontal streaks, and we get boxy shapes, especially when we're shooting into the sun. It's very common with anamorphic lenses. And just to contrast that, here's some more reference of my phone's flashlight. So you can see the flare elements are quite different. And then here's what that original footage would have looked like before the de-squeeze. So we've got a completely square aspect ratio, and everything is sort of squashed horizontally. All right, so we've already touched on the radial rays and horizontal streaks associated with spherical and anamorphic lenses, respectively. But perhaps the most common flare element is glare. Generally speaking, glare appears as a large, soft element around the light source that reduces the contrast of the image in the areas that it occupies. And next up, let's talk about ghosts. So ghosts are bokeh-like elements that rotate around the center of the screen, appearing stuck to a line that is an invisible line, but one that's drawn between the center of the screen and the light source. Ghosts often appear as copies or inverted copies of the light source and tend to show the light source shape, although that's another sort of rule of thumb. And next up, we have halos, which tend to be pretty weird. These are usually circular or elliptical-shaped elements that radially warp the light source. Halos tend to be especially visible when the light source is outside the screen edges, but again, that depends on the lens. It's also worth noting that halos can manifest in many different ways, but something they usually have in common is chromatic aberration. And finally, my absolute favorite element, lens dirt. So if we can imagine a car windshield or something similar that accumulates dirt and grime from being exposed to the outdoors, lens dirt is very similar in concept. Essentially, these are small bits of dust and dirt that may be caked onto the lens or may just be sitting on top of the front element. that appear as out-of-focus bokeh shapes when the front element is illuminated. Usually, front element reflection is visible simultaneously with lens dirt, but as with everything else we've covered, it always depends on the lens being used, and every lens is different. And moving right along to wide angle versus telephoto for our focal length. So whenever I'm explaining the difference between these two, I use the example of zooming in and zooming out on a digital camera. So shooting with a wide-angle lens, we might expect to see lots of smaller ghosts and other flare elements, whereas when shooting with a telephoto lens, we generally expect to see fewer, larger ghosts and other flare elements. This was perhaps not the greatest reference footage that we're about to see, but you can maybe see when we zoom in, we generally see fewer yet larger flare elements. So moving right along, the main difference between a glancing and direct light source in this context is really just the subtlety of the flare. A light source that's at a glancing angle to the lens will usually result in a more subtle flare that's barely visible, if at all, whereas a light source that's shining directly into the lens will produce a much clearer and sharper flare with more visible elements. I'm not going to spend too much time on this next one, but I thought it was worth mentioning just because it's something that I find very interesting. A light source that's outside the screen edges will generally produce a really unique element. And there's no official name for this that I've been able to find, but I generally refer to it as an outside edge flare. So a light source that's right outside the screen edges, but still shining directly into the lens, will produce this strange element. And we can think of this sort of like an anticipatory flare, just before the light source comes on screen. And so here's some reference of a light source that's at a glancing angle, and then just some more reference. So when it comes to the occlusion of the light source, ghosts tend to have the most erratic behavior. Their internal shape and color may change, and they may occlude in a staggered manner as the light source is occluded. As far as the other elements are concerned, they generally tend to become increasingly more subtle or fade out entirely. And so we'll see that here as I swing over to the left. And back again, you can see those ghosts just sort of, it's not a linear fashion, they fade out in a strange order, unpredictable. And moving right along, something that I consider one of the most important concepts, depth of field or blur. So essentially, depending on whether or not the light source is in focus, flare elements will blur accordingly. With a light source that is in focus, we'd expect to see sharper, clearer flare elements than an out-of-focus light source. It's also worth noting that flare elements might change their shape and size while racking focus. And similarly, anamorphic flare elements tend to squash and stretch. So as I rack focus here, we'll see that these flare elements enlarge and become a lot softer. And then everything goes back to being somewhat squashed or stretched, depending on which way I'm racking focus. And finally, chromatic aberration. To quote Hannah Montana, nobody's perfect, and that includes lenses. So chromatic aberration is probably familiar to many of us artists, especially in the post-Spider-Verse era. But for those who may not know, chromatic aberration or color fringing is the failure of the lens to converge or focus all colors to the same point. This results in color fringing as we get closer to the edges of the image. So flare elements like ghosts and halos can be affected by this phenomenon, but again, it's worth noting that all lenses are different, and these flare elements can manifest themselves very differently depending on the lens. And moving right along to light source color and the lens element coding, which we briefly touched on, but just some notes that I'm going to bring up on the screen. Certain flare elements, there's no good rule of thumb here. You just got to look at reference, but some flare elements will pick up the light source color, whereas some flare elements are going to pick up the color that's sort of given from that flare, that lens element coding. And this is something that lens manufacturers work really hard to ensure that flares aren't too intense or intrusive or overwhelming. And so here's some reference I shot of a prism, and you can see that the flare elements that we're getting from that white light source from my phone were not colored at all, or not picking up any other color other than what the lens elements were coated in. But when I run that through the prism, it's picking up a lot of that color. And now it's time to put it all together. So to help conceptualize how we might create a lens flare in a game engine, I'll now demonstrate my process for creating a custom lens flare in After Effects. Before we begin, I'm going to show a list of effects and expressions that I'm using. And as I mentioned previously, I'll be doing my best to keep this a little bit less technical and more artistic. But for the technically minded folks out there, I will say that the most important thing to know when creating a lens flare in a game engine is knowing the screen space position of the light source. You can use this as well as the distance between the light source and the center of the screen to drive the majority of your flare elements' behaviors. So before we get into it, I've got a couple expressions that I want to run up on the screen here. This first one is offsetting the X position of your element opposite to whichever way the light source is moving. So it'll maintain its Y position, but it'll move in like negative X. And then similarly, I have a scale X by distance. And I have a couple of these, so I also have a scale opacity by distance. And really, it's just this kind of thing with any variation of, or anything you could potentially want to drive, any behavior, it's always going to be driven by the distance between the center of the screen and the light source in screen space. And I didn't really use this one, but it's worth running up here. Rotate a flare element based on the light source's position. All right, so here's how I start the setup and create the primary streak. First, I create a new composition, and I start making my light source shape. And if I were doing this as a post-process effect or to composite over footage, I'd actually do this a little bit differently, as we'll see here in a moment. But I'd actually start by applying a threshold to the scene and isolating my highlights that way. And you'll see an example of that momentarily right here. And so that's what I'm talking about, deriving your light source shape from whatever you have, the highlights in the scene. And then I go ahead and I apply some effects and just start roughing in my shape once I get something that's working, I tend to duplicate it and just keep building out the shape that way. And I always mask out my edges, especially when working in After Effects. Cool, so glare. This is generally something I consider to be one of the easier elements. It follows the position of the light source, and you can duplicate your light source shape, scale it up, and blur it out a bunch, and that should get you something pretty good. And then, of course, mask out the edges. All right, so for the radial rays, there's a number of different ways to do this, but in this instance, what I ended up doing is I scaled my light source shape horizontally. I moved it up, and I applied a polar coordinates, which we'll see in a moment here. I also apply a wave warp to get some shape breakup and sort of like a star kind of shape. And I do some adjustments. And then we'll see the polar coordinates right here. And then after that point, you can apply a radial fast blur or something to radially blur those bits out. You can also pinch the center using the bulge effect, whatever floats your boat. And it's worth noting that I always use the add blend mode when compositing these flare elements together in After Effects, although if I were compositing this over footage, I'd use the screen blending mode. However, if I were compositing this in a game engine, I'd probably want to use an additive material. And here you can see me roughing in some ghosts. So the key here is to tie the anchor point to the position, which gets that ghost element rotating around the center of the screen. And I also apply a radial fast blur to this and set the mode to darkest, which gets some of that occlusion behavior. So similar to ghosts, we have streak ghosts, which are the anamorphic streak elements. And the way I set these up is a little bit different, but this is where that expression from the start comes in handy. And so you can see I'm getting the basic behavior. And once I get something that works, I just duplicate it, and I just keep building it out that way. Cool. So moving right along to our chromatic elements, I generally do this by creating a rainbow, blending it together, and once I get something that's working, I just sort of duplicate and adjust as needed, and I just copy-paste those expressions from earlier and get the same kind of look. You can also apply a VR glow and certain other effects to sort of get whatever kind of look you want. And I do believe we're out of time here, unfortunately. So thank you all for watching, listening, and attending. I'm just going to get this process time lapse up. And so here's the whole roughly hour-and-a-half process condensed into like a minute. You can see I made my radial rays slightly differently here. And there you have it. Right, so thank you guys so much.